Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Powell, I actually appreciated some of what you talked about, probably because I was the prime sponsor of the FAST Act legislation last session and going to introduce it again. And I know Ms. Castor is going after me, and I had the ability to serve on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis with her. And one thing we heard from witnesses from all across the ideological spectrum is the interoperability and the intraoperability of our grid is reliant on infrastructure. And regardless of what source of infrastructure that is, the permitting process, primarily with in federal areas, has become so duplicative, burdensome, and just simply takes so long that it's very difficult to raise capital for that. So if you could just talk about that as part of making sure, regardless of which energy is getting on the grid, that we actually have an ability to do this. Because I'm in North Dakota right now, and we obviously deal with these issues better than Texas. We know winter pretty well, but we have rolling blackouts as well right now because of the strain on the grid as a whole from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for the question, Congressman. Thank you for your leadership on this really important issue. We can only build clean energy as fast as we can permit it. And it doesn't really matter what your vision of a clean energy future is, whether it's something that's really, really highly renewable and requires an enormous amount of new transmission and that kind of linear infrastructure centered along with a lot of really large land area developments like very large wind farms or large solar plants, or if it's a vision of the future that has a much more compact clean energy vision, like a lot of carbon capture plants on existing fossil facilities, but that probably requires more pipelines running around the country, taking that carbon dioxide away from those power plants, or if it's a vision with a lot of hydrogen that's going to require a lot of new hydrogen pipelines. Like regardless, we're going to need to build a significant amount of new linear infrastructure in this country, thousands and tens of thousands of miles of this. I think the Princeton Net Zero study that Dr. Bacala was very influential in setting up the meeting has demonstrated that kind of regardless of which clean energy future, we're going to need an enormous amount of this going forward. And so it just cannot be the case that it takes a decade from the beginning of attempting to site a project to actually realizing steel in the ground between the NEPA reviews, the environmental impact statements, the traditional air and water permitting processes, and the local, state, and federal permitting processes all along the way. I'm not suggesting that we sacrifice the environmental reviews or the environmental integrity of any of that, but I think we do need to find ways that we can do more things in parallel as opposed to in sequence, and that we can get to yes and no answers much more quickly in these processes.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. Actually, I mean, people talk about pipelines. We talk about transmission lines. The hardest thing to permit over a federal waterway is a highway. I mean, year in and year out, that's what takes longer than everything else. So, I mean, I'll have plenty of time to fight with my colleagues about what sources of energy that are, and we'll probably go into it in the next minute and 45 seconds. But I think realistically, we have to do a better job of protecting the environment, but getting permitting done. Otherwise, first of all, private capital is going to be chased away because the time constraints just take too long. And secondly, time value of money and energy are really important. But one of the other things I just wanted to talk about is when we talk about renewables versus other sources of energy, we don't talk about the economics of producing energy well enough. Because in North Dakota, we do about 29% of our grid is renewables. But over the last month, when it's been 20 below, it's dropped under 3%. And for a very windy state, it's been unquestionably calm. So coal and natural gas and the other thing we don't talk enough about is primacy on the grid, which is where one of the ways where low natural gas prices are an advantage against coal, but where they really have an advantage against coal is being able to start up and scale down depending on the amount of energy. And you've seen some of this in Texas in the last 2 days. So to oversimplify this in any way, shape, or form, but a coal plant or a natural gas plant has to be economically viable when they're when in North Dakota, they're 70% of the grid because we need them when they're 97% of the grid. And we don't spend enough time talking about that. And I can just guarantee you, when we introduce a bill that somehow harms a wind subsidy in North Dakota, The reason every wind lobbyist from across the country flies into North Dakota is not because they care about the environment. It's because it's become incredibly lucrative, and we have done policies where we allow people to sell energy onto the grid for less than it costs us to produce. And then when we get into these severe weather actions, we run into resiliency problems and we run into reliability problems. And with that, I'll yield back.